You know, it's a funny thing. We had quite a good little relationship. He rang me up one Christmas Day, I think it was, and I heard this. Hello?
At first, it was a story of mutual respect. Two legends bridging generations to make timeless music. Paul McCartney admired Michael Jackson's talent. Michael, in turn, saw Paul as a mentor. But somewhere along the way, that mentorship took a turn. Paul gave Michael one piece of advice that would define their relationship forever. What happened next blindsided him, a move so bold, so unexpected that it left McCartney feeling betrayed by someone he once called a friend. Years later, he would describe it as one of the most painful lessons of his career. The childhood that shaped a Beatle. On June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England, a future legend was born, James Paul McCartney, the son of James and Mary McCartney. Looking back on those early years, Paul often speaks fondly of his parents and the tight-knit community he grew up in. They were ordinary, hard-working people, the kind who formed the backbone of post-war Britain, and they gave him the foundation that would later shape his life. Music was always part of the McCartney household, thanks to his father Jim, who played both trumpet and piano. It wasn't long before Paul started showing a natural talent for it. He taught himself piano by ear, joined the church choir, and before long, music was stitched into the fabric of his life. When Paul turned 14, his father gave him a shiny nickel-plated trumpet. It was a thoughtful gift, but soon rock and roll came crashing into his world, and suddenly the trumpet didn't feel quite right. He wanted a guitar, something he could sing and play at the same time. So he traded that trumpet for an acoustic Framus Zenith guitar worth £15. But there was one small problem. Paul was left-handed. Trying to play a right-handed guitar felt completely backward. That is, until he came across a poster of Slim Whitman, a left-handed guitarist who strummed with the strings reversed. That simple discovery changed everything. Paul flipped the strings on his guitar, and suddenly it all made sense. On that very guitar, he wrote his first song, a tender tune called I Lost My Little Girl. Around the same time, he started tinkering on the piano again and came up with an early version of When I'm 64, a song that wouldn't see the light of day until the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper years later. Of course, no musician thrives in isolation. Paul needed bandmates, people who shared his passion for sound. That opportunity arrived in 1954 when a 12-year-old Paul met another local boy while riding the bus, George Harrison. The two bonded over music and quickly became friends, not realizing they'd one day change music history together. A few years later, at just 15, Paul went to a church fete at St. Peter's in Woolton, where he saw a skiffle group called the Quarrymen performing. Their lead singer and guitarist, a charismatic teenager named John Lennon, immediately caught his attention. The band's raw energy was unlike anything Paul had heard before. When the Quarrymen later invited him to join as a rhythm guitarist, he accepted, unknowingly stepping into a partnership that would redefine popular music. John Lennon later recalled that moment vividly, calling it the day things truly began to move. Even the churchyard where that meeting happened would later become part of Beatles lore, home to the gravestone that inspired the timeless song Eleanor Rigby. But Paul and John's bond went far beyond music. Both boys carried deep emotional scars from losing their mothers at a young age. For Paul, the pain ran especially deep. His mother, Mary, a devoted nurse, was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a mastectomy. Tragically, she passed away on October 31, 1956, at just 47, from complications following the surgery. The loss shattered Paul's world. His father was overwhelmed with grief, some say even suicidal, before eventually finding the strength to raise Paul and his brother Michael on his own. For young Paul, that pain never really faded. It stayed with him, quietly shaping who he was and how he expressed himself. Music became his refuge, his way of turning heartbreak into something beautiful. Around that time, John Lennon's mother, Julia, became a comforting figure for Paul. She understood his loss in a way few could, but then fate struck again. Just a year later, John lost his own mother in a car accident, a tragedy that would bond the two boys even more deeply. From that moment, they weren't just bandmates. They were two young men bound by shared loss, turning pain into melody and sorrow into something eternal. That connection would become the emotional heartbeat of the Beatles and the driving force behind some of the most beautiful songs ever written. How failure made Paul McCartney great. Now here's a story that not many people know. Everyone recognizes Paul McCartney as the legendary bassist and one half of the Beatles' songwriting duo. But when he first joined the group, back in their early days as the Quarrymen, he wasn't brought in to play bass at all. His role was supposed to be the band's lead guitarist. At the time, Paul was actually more technically skilled on the guitar than anyone else in the group, even John Lennon. So when the teenage band started shifting from their skiffle roots into proper rock and roll, Paul was the natural choice to take the lead. His live debut came on October 18, 1957, at the new Club Moore Hall in Norris Green, Liverpool. That night should have marked the beginning of something big. Instead, it turned into one of those early career moments you can't help but laugh about later. On what could technically be called Paul McCartney's Beatles debut, he froze. The young musician, just 15 at the time, completely blanked during his guitar solo on Arthur Smith's Guitar Boogie. Stage fright hit him hard, and his fingers simply wouldn't cooperate. Paul later recalled in the Beatles anthology that while he could play the solo easily in rehearsal, everything fell apart once the spotlight hit. He admitted that he panicked, thinking, "What am I doing here?" That little slip ended up changing history. George Harrison was soon brought in to handle lead guitar, and the rest, as they say, was destiny. Even the club promoter that night wasn't impressed. He scribbled the words "good and bad" on the band's visiting card, likely a nod to the nervous newcomer who'd one day become one of the greatest musicians in the world. Offstage, Paul's passion for music was rivaled by his interest in his first serious girlfriend, Dorothy Rohn, whom he met in 1959 at the Casbah Club. But according to Beatles biographer Bob Spitz, that relationship had a darker side. Paul could be controlling, trying to shape Dorothy into his idea of the perfect partner. He chose her clothes, her makeup, even paid for her to get her hair styled like French actress Brigitte Bardot, a look he and John Lennon were both obsessed with. He disapproved of her smoking and hanging out with friends, even though he never followed those same rules himself. Meanwhile, the Quarrymen were evolving fast. By 1960, after cycling through names like Johnny and the Moondogs, the Silver Beatles, and even Beatles, they finally settled on the name that would change music forever, the Beatles. With that decision made, they packed their gear and headed to Hamburg, Germany, eager to make their mark. Life in Hamburg was wild. Paul kept in touch with Dorothy through letters, but he also dove headfirst into the city's nightlife. Later, he admitted to having numerous relationships there, many with escorts, saying the women in Hamburg were experts in the art of lovemaking. The band also began using Preludin, a stimulant that kept them awake through the marathon sets that stretched into the early morning hours. It was here that Paul began what would become a complicated relationship with drugs and excess. But the Hamburg story gets even crazier. One night, as the Beatles were being forced out of Germany after a string of problems, Paul and drummer Pete Best found themselves in a dark room, packing up their gear. In a moment of teenage mischief, they decided to light up the space by setting a condom on fire and attaching it to the wall. It was meant as a harmless joke, but the club owner didn't see it that way. Already upset that the band had signed a deal with one of his competitors, he called the police and accused Paul of arson. The irony? The club's walls were made of non-flammable stone. Still, the prank landed McCartney and Best in a German jail cell overnight. The next morning, police added them to the deportation list, sending them home to Liverpool alongside George Harrison, who had already been kicked out for being underage. That left John Lennon and bassist Stu Sutcliffe behind, though not for long. John returned about 10 days later. Stu stayed behind, enrolling in the Hamburg School of Art and starting a relationship with a local woman. Sadly, just 2 years later, he died from a brain hemorrhage, a tragedy that deeply affected the band. That chaotic 1960 trip to Hamburg revealed both the recklessness and resilience that would define the Beatles' rise to fame. Paul McCartney might have found trouble abroad, lighting fires, testing limits, but it was back home in Liverpool where the real challenges of his journey were just beginning. When Paul McCartney returned to Liverpool after that wild non-stop run in Hamburg, he was exhausted, but full of confidence. The Beatles had sharpened their sound, built their stamina, and tasted the kind of freedom that comes from playing night after night in front of rowdy crowds. But just as he got home, life hit him with something completely unexpected. His girlfriend Roan told him she was pregnant. McCartney was stunned. Suddenly, this young man chasing a dream found himself facing fatherhood. He did what most would have done. He proposed. They even picked a wedding date. And for a brief moment, it seemed like McCartney's life was taking a different turn, one rooted in family rather than fame. But tragedy struck. Roan suffered a miscarriage before the wedding. The loss was devastating, and soon after, McCartney ended the engagement. With no baby and no marriage ahead, he was free again. No emotional ties, no responsibilities. That freedom would soon become the fuel behind the Beatles' unstoppable rise. By 1962, everything started to change. Ringo Starr and George Harrison were now part of the official lineup, and the group had just written their first hit, Love Me Do. Within a year, that single was everywhere. By 1963, the Lennon-McCartney partnership had turned into one of the most powerful songwriting duos the world had ever seen. Songs like I Saw Her Standing There and Can't Buy Me Love became instant classics, and before long the band's sound leapt across the Atlantic, sparking Beatlemania in America. Now you might think that level of fame would be overwhelming. The endless touring, the screaming fans, the constant pressure. It all sounds exhausting, but McCartney didn't see it that way. In his book The Eye of the Storm, he described it as the fulfillment of a dream. He once told CNN that while people might have assumed it was miserable or claustrophobic, he saw it differently. For him, it was like being at the center of an incredible film, one he had always wanted to star in. Still, fame came with its downsides. Each Beatle got labeled by the press. John was the witty one, George the quiet one, and Paul got stuck with a tag he absolutely hated, the cute Beatle. It was a label that followed him for decades. He said he never liked it. Not even a little. Sure, he understood being remembered as a Beatle. That was something he could live with. He even compared it to movie legends who could never escape their image, like Greta Garbo or Brigitte Bardot. But being the cute one, that wasn't him. As he put it, maybe there were flashes of that early on, but as time went on, the edges got harder and the label just didn't fit anymore. He talked about it again years later on The Howard Stern Show, saying how frustrating it was that the media boxed them in with simple nicknames. Once people decided he was the cute one, there was no escaping it. Don't call me that, he'd say. I hate that. But once it stuck, it stayed. Still, even with all the labels and frustrations, the best and wildest was yet to come. The world hadn't seen anything close to what the Beatles were about to unleash next, when Paul lost everything and everyone. By the time the 1960s hit their stride, the Beatles had evolved far beyond the mop-topped band that first took the world by storm. They were changing, creatively, musically, and personally. Paul McCartney, in particular, was diving headfirst into the avant-garde scene, pulling wild new ideas into the studio and experimenting with anything that could push their sound forward. He even started dabbling in abstract film projects, exploring his artistic side in ways that went way beyond music. Most people tend to credit John Lennon for the psychedelic magic of Tomorrow Never Knows, but that trippy soundscape was actually Paul's doing. He pieced it together using tape loops, tiny fragments of sound spliced and layered to create something entirely new. It was brilliant and just a little bit mad. But with two creative powerhouses like Paul and John trying to steer the same ship, tension was inevitable. Cracks had already started to show around the Rubber Soul era. The group was exhausted, completely burned out from endless touring and overwhelming fame. Paul would later admit that it felt like they were losing their souls. That exhaustion hit so hard that, after their 1966 US tour, the Beatles decided to stop performing live altogether. Still, Paul wasn't the type to slow down. He channeled his creative restlessness into what would become Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The idea was bold. He wanted the Beatles to reinvent themselves, to shed their old image and perform under a new identity. "We were fed up with being the Beatles," he said later. "We were men now, not boys. We wanted to be artists." The result was a masterpiece, critically acclaimed, genre-defining, and revolutionary. But ironically, it also marked the beginning of the end. In 1967, tragedy struck. Brian Epstein, their beloved manager and a stabilizing father figure, died unexpectedly. His death left a massive void. Paul naturally stepped into the leadership role, but not everyone was happy with that. Lennon would later say it felt like Paul was leading the band in circles, and that frustration slowly eroded what was left of their unity. As things crumbled around him, Paul started searching for something steady, something real. That's when Linda Eastman entered the picture. Linda wasn't just another pretty face. She was a talented photographer who had carved out a name for herself in the rock scene. Early in her career, she had hustled her way into a private Rolling Stones promo event, where she was the only photographer allowed in. By 1968, she'd already made history as the first woman to shoot a Rolling Stone magazine cover. She had grit, charm, and serious talent. In May 1967, Paul was the most eligible bachelor on the planet. After attending a dinner party hosted by Epstein to celebrate the completion of Sgt. Pepper, he headed to one of his favorite hangouts, the Bag o' Nails nightclub in London's Soho district. It was there, amid the smoky haze and electric music, that he met Linda. She was in town shooting for a project called Rock and Other Four-Letter Words, and had come to the club with friends from the Animals. When Paul spotted her across the room, he knew he had to make a move. As she passed by, he stood up, playfully blocked her path, and introduced himself. Then came his impulsive but smooth invitation. He asked her to join him at another club afterward. Linda was intrigued. What really hooked her, though, was when Paul mentioned that he owned original paintings by surrealist artist René Magritte. She was a big fan, so she agreed to see them. That night, she went back to his place and ended up staying until morning. At the time, Paul was still with actress Jane Asher, so nothing serious could happen right away. But the spark between him and Linda was undeniable. After his relationship with Jane ended, Paul couldn't stop thinking about Linda. In 1968, he finally reached out and told her to come to London. She did, and from there, things moved quickly. That fall, after finishing the White Album, Paul flew to New York to spend time with Linda and her young daughter, Heather. Away from the chaos of Beatlemania, he found rare peace. He even grew a beard and walked the city freely, unrecognized by fans. It was a glimpse of the normal life he'd been missing. By the end of that year, Paul knew Linda was the one. During a trip to Portugal, he proposed, and they were married in March 1969 at the Marylebone Registry Office in London. It wasn't a flashy wedding, quite the opposite. The day was gray and rainy, but that didn't stop hundreds of fans from crowding the steps outside. Paul's brother Mike was supposed to be best man, but his train broke down, so he arrived late. The ceremony went ahead anyway, with Mike and the Beatles' assistant, Mal Evans, signing as witnesses. Linda's daughter Heather was there too. But here's the twist. The wedding almost didn't happen. Paul later revealed that they'd had a huge argument the night before and nearly called the whole thing off. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but that's what made it real. Paul would later laugh about how people saw them as this ideal showbiz couple, when in truth, they had their ups and downs just like everyone else. They weren't gliding through life untouched by trouble. They were right in the middle of it, together. Still, their love held strong. But it was hard to ignore one glaring detail about that wedding. None of the other Beatles showed up. That wasn't an accident. Paul admitted he hadn't invited them, saying the band had already fractured beyond repair. They weren't the same tight-knit group anymore. And just when things couldn't get more chaotic, a bizarre rumor started making headlines later that year. Fans began claiming that Paul McCartney had actually died in a 1966 car crash and been replaced by a look-alike. The Paul is dead conspiracy spread like wildfire, with people combing through album covers and lyrics looking for hidden clues. Eventually, Paul had to set the record straight. He posed with Linda, baby Mary, and Heather for the cover of Life magazine under the headline, "Paul is still with us." That family portrait finally silenced the rumors. But even as fans breathed a sigh of relief, the real heartbreak was still to come. The Beatles were falling apart. Years of creative tension had finally taken their toll, and on April 10, 1970, Paul announced that he was leaving the band. Losing the Beatles sent him into a deep depression. For someone who'd spent his entire adult life as part of that brotherhood, It felt like the ground had vanished beneath his feet. That's when Linda became his anchor. She urged him to start over, to find peace and purpose again. Together, they retreated to Scotland, settling at High Park Farm in Campbelltown near the Mull of Kintyre. It was land Paul had bought years earlier at Jane Asher's suggestion but had rarely visited. Now, it became his sanctuary. Life there was simple, just Paul, Linda, Heather, and the open countryside. For the first time in years, he could breathe. He called it real freedom, describing it as an escape from fame and chaos. And Linda, with her love of nature and steady presence, kept reminding him that he still had so much more to give. That quiet life in Scotland marked the beginning of something new. With Linda by his side, Paul McCartney slowly found his creative spark again, and the next chapter of his story was about to begin. The tragedy that changed Paul forever. Paul McCartney wrote something truly special for Linda, Maybe I'm Amazed. It was his way of showing how much her strength had carried him through the emotional storm of the Beatles breaking up. After releasing a successful solo album, Paul wasn't content to stop there. He took a bold leap and formed a brand new band called Wings. Now, Linda wasn't exactly known for her singing, but Paul made sure she was right there beside him. Starting a new band after leading the biggest group in music history must have been terrifying. But Paul had nothing to worry about. Wings started small, slowly building momentum, and before long they were massive. The band launched in 1971 with Wildlife and Red Rose Speedway. But it was 1973's Band on the Run that truly changed everything. That record was a smash, both critically and commercially, and gave the world 2 top 10 singles, Jet and Band on the Run. Around that time, they also delivered the unforgettable title track for the James Bond film Live and Let Die. While Paul continued to dominate the charts, Linda focused on her growing passion for animal rights. She launched a vegetarian food company and wrote several best-selling vegetarian cookbooks, becoming a pioneer for the movement long before it went mainstream. The 1970s turned out to be a decade of triumphs for Paul. A string of awards, chart-topping hits, and a brand new musical identity after the Beatles. But just as the Wings era began to fade, tragedy struck in the most devastating way possible. John Lennon had been shot. He was gone forever. When reporters swarmed Paul outside a recording studio, desperate for a reaction, his response shocked everyone. He muttered, almost absently, "Drag, isn't it?" The world was stunned by what sounded like a cold, emotionless reaction. But Paul later admitted he deeply regretted those words, explaining that he had been in complete shock, too numb to process what had happened. Over the years, he's spoken often about how deeply John's death broke his heart. Then came another heartbreak. In 1995, Linda McCartney was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it was already far too advanced. For a while, chemotherapy seemed to bring hope, but in March 1998, doctors discovered the cancer had spread to her liver. Paul later described those 2 years as a living nightmare. He said Linda never complained and never gave up hope, even when the odds were stacked against her. But in the end, as Paul put it, it was not to be. During her final days, Paul carried a heavy secret. After doctors told him her liver was failing and she only had a few days left, he decided not to tell her, believing she wouldn't want to know. According to the book Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney, he wanted to preserve her peace for as long as possible. They shared one last ride together through the Arizona desert. The next day, she was too weak to get out of bed. By the following day, she was gone. As the end approached, Paul tried to comfort her with a beautiful image. He told her she was on her favorite Appaloosa horse, riding through the woods on a bright spring day, surrounded by bluebells under a clear blue sky. It was his way of giving her one last moment of peace, a memory to carry into forever. After Linda's passing, Paul retreated from the public eye to grieve privately. Eventually, he opened up to a close friend, Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders. She mentioned how Paul and Linda had never spent a single night apart during their marriage, except for the brief time he spent in jail after a marijuana arrest. Paul's answer was simple and heartbreaking. He said he just loved being with her, and that was what made losing her so unbearable. In the year that followed, Paul admitted that he cried often, almost to the point of embarrassment, but he also said it was the only thing that felt right. He later revealed that the pain of losing Linda stirred up old memories. His own mother had died of breast cancer when he was young, though he hadn't understood it at the time. He remembered his father holding in his emotions, never letting his children see him cry. Paul, in contrast, allowed himself to feel everything. One of Paul's most meaningful songs, Let It Be, came from a dream that connected both these losses. Many people assumed Mother Mary referred to the Virgin Mary, but it was actually inspired by his late mother, Mary McCartney. During a difficult period in his life, he dreamt she came to him, gently reassuring him that everything would be all right and simply telling him to let it be. When he woke up, the words and melody flowed out of him effortlessly, becoming one of the most timeless songs ever written. Paul McCartney utterly despised him. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, an unlikely partnership began to form between Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson. The whole thing kicked off in a way that was almost cinematic. One day, out of nowhere, Michael Jackson picked up the phone and called Paul directly. McCartney later recalled thinking it was just an overly eager fan. He even got annoyed, wondering how someone had managed to get his private number. But it wasn't a fan at all, it was Michael Jackson himself, and his message was simple. He wanted to make hits, and that's exactly what they did. Together, they created a trio of major songs, Say, 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 The Girl Is Mine, and The Man. The collaboration wasn't just about the music, though. Around that time, Jackson's Thriller had taken over the world, and he and McCartney had become genuine friends. For a while, it seemed like one of the most powerful creative pairings in pop music. After Thriller's massive success, Jackson reportedly went to McCartney for advice on how to handle his new wealth. Paul, who had already been in the business for decades, told him to invest in music publishing, to buy the rights to songs because that's where the real money was. It turned out to be advice that would come back to haunt him. Not long after, Michael Jackson took that tip to heart in a big way. In 1985, when the ATV music catalog went up for sale, including the publishing rights to more than 200 Beatles songs, Jackson made a move that would shock the entire music world. He bought it all for $47.5 million. Just like that, Michael Jackson owned the rights to most of the Beatles' classic hits, effectively beating McCartney to his own music. For Paul, it was a crushing blow. He had long hoped to reclaim ownership of those songs one day, and to see a friend make that move instead felt deeply personal. McCartney later said it felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under him. When he confronted Jackson about it, the King of Pop reportedly told him it was nothing personal, just business. After that, the two drifted apart. There was no dramatic fallout, just a quiet end to what had once been a great friendship. Years later, when Michael Jackson passed away in 2009, rumors started spreading that he had left the Beatles catalog to McCartney in his will. Fans loved the idea of such a poetic gesture, a final act of reconciliation between two legends. But the rumor wasn't true. McCartney himself clarified that Jackson hadn't left him any rights at all. He even dismissed the reports that he'd been devastated by it, saying he never believed the story in the first place. Still, McCartney eventually got his happy ending. Through his own deals, he was able to regain control of his music catalog years later. And despite everything that happened, he spoke fondly of Michael Jackson after his passing, saying he felt lucky to have worked with him. It was a complicated friendship that began with creativity, ended in business, and left behind one of the most fascinating chapters in music history.